the first one I think was in November, and it was following COP26, and it was looking at issues such as debt and economics and things like that. And this is our first roundtable inviting religious leaders. And I know that a call was put out to lots of different faith groups, and so there's been a big effort to be as diverse as we can, and this will be the first of several, we think. So there's plenty of opportunity in the future to become even more diverse. So you're very, very welcome to be here. The format is kind of for each of you, I think you've agreed to speak between 5 and 10 minutes. If you can keep to that, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, we're in danger of going over time. There'll be then an opportunity for each of you to reflect upon what one another have said, or to ask questions of one another, to kind of open up a bit of a panel discussion. And there'll be opportunity for us to pose some questions that we've pre-prepared or that might appear in the chat. Does that all seem okay? And would it also seem okay with you? Would you like to introduce yourselves as we, before you start your 5 or 10 minutes? Would you like to introduce yourselves, just to let everybody know who you are? Is that okay? Yeah. What else do I need to think about? I guess we're thinking about order of events. Would anybody prefer to go first? Or shall I pick someone? I could start with the first person who would arrive first, which would be Arthur. Would that be okay, Arthur? Would you like to go first? I think he might have the prize for being in environmentalism for longer than any of us. So maybe it's fitting that you go first.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I'm Arthur Dahl. I'm an environmental scientist. My specialty, in fact, is coral reef ecology. I spoke at the first Earth Day in Washington in 1970. I was at the Stockholm Conference in 1972. I had many years in my career. I created a regional program of all the governments of the Pacific Islands. And then I worked for many years for UNEP in the Regional Seas program, and then as the coordinator of UN System-Wide Earthwatch, coordinating all efforts to monitor and assess the global environment. But I've been retired for 20 years now, so I'm working on issues of global governance in general, and new measures of the system that get away from economic measures. I've been working on a whole new set of global accounting without using money to get back to the reality of human well-being and environmental well-being. So that's a sort of background on me. I'm a member of the Baha'i Faith. I've been a Baha'i all of my life. But maybe to start with, really say, what is the role of faith, of religion or whatever, with respect to the issues that you're so concerned about? And I think really, I think we would all admit that we have what we might call an animal nature, which is what comes out in much of our time. But we also have a potential, at least, for a spiritual nature, a spiritual purpose, something higher than just eating and sleeping and feeling rich or whatever. And you might think that the purpose of religion has always been, what we might say, the divine educators, to help us to develop that higher self, and that that's all the faith traditions have taught those things. In fact, the Baha'is have a progressive view of, I think all religions have come from the same source, had the same purpose, including the many indigenous faiths, the wonderful traditions of the indigenous peoples of the world. And of course, the founders of all of our faiths taught by the example as much as by word. While they've all provided some kind of scriptures, a holy book or whatever that is sort of a text guidance, but also they lived the principles that they taught. And that's the side of, you might say, of faith that can really motivate transformation, and individually and socially. And so I think in terms of the issues that you're looking at, it's important to say that what is the role of faith traditions in trying to bring about the change that we're all looking for. To introduce the Baha'i Faith very briefly, the central founder took the title of Baha'u'llah, means the glory of God, was a Persian in the 19th century, born in 1817, died in 1892. He spent most of his life in exile and a prisoner. He was imprisoned in the fortress of Akka in the Holy Land in 1868 and died there a prisoner in 1892. But we believe that this is why the Baha'i World Center is in Haifa, Israel. And he really renewed God's message for today with the principles and institutions that we need for a united world. This is the time to really move to the global level, in our functioning, and we need, a set of values to take us to that last step in world unity. He talked about the harmony of science and religion. That's why I became a scientist as a Baha'i. His son, Abdul Baha, was imprisoned with the family in 1868 and only released the Young Turks Revolution in 1908. Whereas I was an old man, he finally traveled to Europe and America to bring his father's faith to the West. And many of the principles I'll be sharing with you came from talks that he gave in England or in America at that time. So this is not particularly recent. And Baha'u'llah provided for an international elected body to guide the Baha'i faith. And this is the Universal House of Justice, which has a seat in Mount Carmel in Haifa and provides guidance for us to today. And I'll quote again from some of its guidance as well on this issue. 3 points to start with in terms of, might say the source of our thinking about respect to justice as it relates to the challenges that we're facing with the economy. Baha'u'llah wrote, "The best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. By its aid thou shalt see with thine own eyes and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor." And then Abdul Baha explained, "And among the teachings of Baha'u'llah are justice and right. Until these are realized on the plane of existence, all things shall be in disorder and remain imperfect. The world of mankind is a world of oppression and cruelty and a realm of aggression and error, which is what we have when we don't have any kind of faith tradition or higher values to aspire to. We end up with the kind of world we see with many of our leaders in the world today." And Baha'u'llah also warned us, and this of course is back to the 19th century, that the civilization so often vaunted, or the learned exponents of arts and sciences will, if allowed to overstep the bounds of moderation, bring great evil upon men. The day is approaching when its flame will devour the cities. So he warned us about too much material civilization and forgetting the spiritual side of things. We find in the Baha'i faith a serious critique of the present economic system. And I quote a few of the texts of the Universal House of Justice specifically on this, when they talked about how dogmatic materialism had captured all centers of power and information at the global level, ensuring that no competing voices would retain the ability to challenge projects of worldwide economic exploitation. And they warned about these man-made ideologies that abandon starving millions to a market system that too clearly is aggravating the plight of the majority of mankind, while a few of us live in conditions of affluence. And they said that the time is coming when the dogma of materialism, whether the East or the West of capitalism or socialism, must explain why the vast majority of the world's peoples are still sinking ever deeper into hunger and wretchedness. And they criticized, as unworthy and unacceptable, the approaches of attaining wealth, such as exploitation of others, the monopolization and manipulation of markets, and the production of goods that promote violence and immortality. So we can see there's already in the Baha'i writings a very strong critique of the present economic system. So we really think we need a spiritual approach founded in ethics and values to address some of these problems. And therefore, to get rid of the economic inequalities, we need a fundamental shift in perspective. So we look at essential concepts like the true purpose of life, the nature of progress, the meaning of true happiness and well-being, and the place that material pursuits should assume in one's individual and family life. And that social justice will only be attained when every member of society has basic material prosperity and has some kind of spiritual qualities. So the solution to our prevailing economic difficulties is to be sought as much in the application of spiritual principles as in the implementation of scientific methods and approaches. And the Baha'i international community, in one of his statements, talked about the failure to place economics in a larger social and spiritual perspective, leading to corrosive materialism and the persistent conditions of deprivation among the masses of the world. And so they called for new economic models that would further a dynamic, just, and thriving social order. These economic systems need to be strongly altruistic and cooperative in nature. They will provide meaningful employment and help to eradicate poverty in the world. You might say those could be, you might say, the design criteria for a new economic system. What should it really be doing? How should it function? In a much more just and thriving, cooperative, altruistic nature. So, and there are many Baha'i principles relevant to this, many of which Abdul Baha talked about in his travels in the West, like being content with little, not wanting more than you really need, focusing on altruism and voluntary sharing. The Baha'i talks about the elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty. We should neither have excessive riches nor anybody living in poverty. Which means, for instance, they proposed a graduated income tax up to 50% of one's income and a tax on accumulated wealth. This is back, 1912. A guaranteed minimum income, eliminating poverty. Anybody, a farmer whose crops fail, should receive what they need from the community so they can go on and plant the next year, not be driven off of the land. We also believe that work is worship. We have an obligation to work, to be a benefit to society, to be of some kind of service. But of course, this is not simply employment as we had it now, but also, a woman's work taking care of the home should be considered as work. Many kinds of social services, all of the things should be part of the ways in which one contribute to society. The Baha'i writings talk about profit sharing of corporations. Abdul Baha said, the owners should give 20% of their shares to the employees and share the profits with them. There should be no more trusts or corporations in a monopoly position in the future. So the kind of giant corporations we have today don't fit in our Baha'i vision of future society. We talk about sustainability. Abdul Baha warned about not destroying the natural order and respecting nature and its biodiversity. We, of course, also believe in peace, abolition of war, and collective security, new approaches to governance. We have a whole system of governance in the Baha'i Faith with elected bodies. No individual has power or authority, but democratic elections with no nominations or campaigning to choose those who decide collectively in the Baha'i community at the local, national, or international level. It's a whole new approach to governance. We avoid partisan politics. We believe unity is important. And we're working for a world federation of governments to manage the global resources and distribute them equitably to all the peoples of the world, which is why I went to the United Nations and worked with the United Nations for many years. Of course, at the individual level, this means we need to try to set an example, both as an individual and as communities. So the House of Justice said that we should not look at this, these systems that where we tolerate injustice with indifference, and disproportionate gain is seen as the emblem of success. We should avoid these pernicious attitudes, such as dishonesty in one's transactions or economic exploitation of others. They said there should be no contradiction between one's economic conduct and one's beliefs. And we should work for fairness and equity. And humanity is weary of a want of a pattern of life to which to aspire that will give hope to the world. This is the kind of thing that Baha'is are trying in their small way to set an example that there are other ways of living in the world. And again, the House of Justice said we should, all these negative forces that generate materialism and corruption that is so widespread in the world, that we really say, how do we look for the kinds of careers where we can gain wealth through earnest effort in fields such as agriculture, commerce, the arts, and industry, and not kinds of getting rich through exertion or through dishonorable means. So we working for the progress of society in a spiritual frame, looking at those values that really can bring true happiness, like the development of spiritual qualities such as honesty, trustworthiness, generosity, justice, consideration for others, and recognizing that material means are to be expended for the betterment of the world. So we're working for a vision, a shared ethic for the world, saying that there's inherent moral dimension to generation, distribution, utilization of wealth and resources. And if we want to overcome these deepening fractures in society today, we need to say that the world is in desperate need of a shared ethic, a sure framework for addressing the crises that gather like storm clouds. And we're in the middle of those today. And so, sort of in conclusion, the House has said, the vision of Baha'u'llah challenges many of the assumptions that we see in contemporary society, that self-interest, far from needing to be restrained, drives prosperity, or that progress depends on its expression through relentless competition. To view the world as an individual cheaply in terms of how much one can accumulate, how many goods can consume, is totally alien to our Baha'i way of thinking. Wealth should serve humanity. Its use must accord with spiritual principles. And so we need new systems that could be created, as I described. And Baha'u'llah said himself, no light can compare with the light of justice. The establishment of order in the world and equality of nations depend on it. So it's a very brief summary. There's much more in the Baha'i faith, but with relevant to your particular case, I just want to show that we're working as hard as you are to try to bring out the changes that are needed in the world in our own way, bringing in a spiritual dimension. And the Baha'i communities is the second most widespread religion in the world. It's all over the world. In almost every single country, you will find Baha'is, at least in small numbers, trying to bring about change from the bottom up at the grassroots in the hope that we can lay foundation for better society in the future. So thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take part in the discussion afterwards.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. So I'm kind of minded to move straight on to the next speaker, unless anybody's got a very direct question that really can't wait until the panel discussion, something, maybe something for clarification. Otherwise, we'll move straight on. Okay, so Shannon isn't able to spend the entire session with us, so I'm going to call him next, if that's okay. So
yes, yeah, thank you very much, Darcy, and thank you, Rob, for getting in touch in the first place. So it's really nice to be in touch and to see many new faces and also some familiar faces here. I guess for me, so spoiler alert, I'm not actually a religious leader, but in my current role or roles, I do work with lots of formal religious leaders. So let me just tell you a bit about myself and how I got to where I got to and what that can maybe tell you about the role of religion or faith in global justice and social justice. So my name is Shannon Shah. I am part-time director of a charity called Faith for the Climate. So we're basically an NGO which works with any or everyone who is inspired by their faith or who wants to work with people of faith, if they're not someone who has a faith background themselves, to work on climate action. And we encourage and celebrate a diversity of tactics, a diversity of strategies. Rob was just in one of our meetings this afternoon, following up our work on COP26, where we were very much focusing on finance in terms of climate justice. So how to end all subsidies for fossil fuels and how to get new and additional finance for climate-related loss and damage. How did I get to Faith for the Climate? My background is not in the climate movement or the environment movement. Indeed, I moved to the UK 12 years ago. I'm from Malaysia originally. I identify as Muslim. And back in Malaysia, I guess my work in human rights and social justice began with a bit of a moral and spiritual crisis, because in my early 20s, before that, actually, I received a scholarship from the Malaysian state-owned oil and gas company Petronas to study for an engineering degree in Australia. But the more I studied chemical engineering and the more I learned about the oil and gas industry, and when I actually worked in it, the more I discovered things that didn't sit well with me ethically and morally. And this was a time just after I learned about the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and other Nigerian activists and environmentalists. So eventually, I started pivoting away from my job in the corporate sector. I started getting involved in the human rights and social justice movement in Malaysia and eventually quit my job at Petronas, which meant that I'm in debt to this day because they paid for my studies in Australia. So leaving them meant that I had to basically pay back lots and lots of money, but that was fine because it was for my own conscience and my own mental health and well-being. But since then, I was involved in quite a lot of human rights activism in Malaysia. For a while, I was the director of the Malaysian chapter of Amnesty International. And one of the things I constantly had to grapple with was the tension between working with Muslims as a Muslim when they are victims of human rights abuse, but also working when Muslims are perpetrators of human rights abuses. So that happens in Malaysia and in many other environments when, for example, journalists and environmentalists and religious minorities and so on are subjected to human rights violations. But that also, you know, that picture changes also in, and let's remember that many of the people who are subjected to those abuses are also Muslims in Malaysia. Lots of trade union activists and environmentalists are also Muslims, and they are victimized by a supposedly Muslim state. And coming to the UK post-war on terror, post-7/7 London bombings, post-ISIS, it's also a very emotional experience being part of a community that's so stigmatized and that is subject to so much bad press and also actual human rights violations by a supposedly liberal democratic state. So this is what I brought with me to the UK, where I decided after years in activism to have some time to reflect and to just go deeper into the issues. And this is why I did a master's and a PhD in the sociology of religion at King's College London. My PhD was compared the experiences of gay Muslims in Malaysia and Britain. And quite a lot of it was about how these debates on social justice and the actual implications in people's daily lives, how that panned out in both countries. And it's from there, since finishing my PhD and thinking what I wanted to do next, when I thought, I really do want to combine my different passions and areas of interest and to do something now that I just really care about, which is climate justice. So this is the analysis that I bring to the job that I have now. Apart from Faith for the Climate, I'm also a part-time academic researcher and and I also teach part-time religious studies at the University of London. And I also work with a Muslim charity called the Muslim Institute, helping to edit their quarterly publication called Critical Muslim. So these are the different roles that I juggle. And I think I don't want to say so much about what Islam represents or what it does or what the Prophet stood for, because I think I've learned enough to know that it's quite personally complex for everyone who grows up Muslim and internalizes Islam in different contexts. So I have my own set of inspirations as a Muslim. You know, there's the Islamic concept of Tawheed, which is the unicity of all creation, that really guides what I do. There are Quranic passages, you know, for example, chapter 30, verse 22, chapter 49, verse 13, that talk about the importance of respecting difference, of working with it, of upholding social justice, of looking after people who are marginalized. There are traditions of the Prophet which are documented in the Quran as well, where he was corrected when he was doing wrong by people, by women that he wasn't paying attention to, by disabled people that he wasn't paying attention to. So all that is in the Islamic tradition, and you know, a lot of that is embedded. I think my work is an extension of my spirituality, even if it doesn't always appear that way. And I think that's why I like being in an environment like Faith for the Climate, because yes, I am Muslim, it means a lot to me, but I love working with different people who interpret faith or express faith in their own ways. And it's really beautiful to learn from so many different people, but who all come together for a common goal, which is to address the climate emergency. And what we have been doing at Faith for the Climate is try to move that discussion so that we're not just talking about, you know, saving the planet as people of faith, because that's kind of an empty platitude now. We have to really think about justice. It is the people who are least responsible for the climate crisis who are suffering the most, who have historically suffered the most. And it is the people who are most responsible for it now and historically who have to take the biggest steps to repair this. Right? So this is where we want to take Faith for the Climate as a network. And I think in doing this, the thing that keeps coming back to me over and over again is a saying by one of my favorite Islamic role models. You all probably know who I'm talking about, the Sufi poet and mystic and jurist Jalaluddin Rumi, who says, you are not a drop in the ocean. You are the ocean in a drop. And I think that's what gives me, it's that nice combination of humility, but also vastness and connectedness, that we all contain the universe within ourselves, but we can all come together and make waves as well. So I guess I'll stop there for now, because I'd really like to listen to some of you as well, as I have to go soon, but thank you so much. Salam.
Thank you very much. Gosh, that was really thought-provoking. Thank you ever so much. Okay, so I'm looking for willing victims. Who's going next? Who would like to go next? Would you like? Thank you.
I'm happy to go next. Is it possible to share the screen? I've got a wee PowerPoint just to work through.
I think that's down to Rob's technical nous. Thank you, Robert.
Okay, just waiting for it to. There we go. Should allow me to share my screen. Here we go. Right, so if I just go to slideshow, play from start. Here we go. Right, Jubilee for Climate is the title of my short 5 to 10 minute presentation. I'm going to try and stick within those parameters. Just a little bit about myself. I'm currently the Professor of Climate and Social Justice at the University of Winchester. I was trained as a theologian, and most people know me as a filmmaker. I've spent the last 25 years working for Channel 4 BBC Discovery, making films about religion, culture, politics. I tend to do most of my work now on BBC World Service radio and independent film. Rather than, I'm too old and not good in looking enough now for Channel 4, so they throw you out on radio, you see, when you reach a certain age. What I want to do in this short presentation is just entangle 3 themes: Jubilee in Scripture, Black theology, which is the main discipline that I teach and write in, and then thinking about what this means for Jubilee for the climate. Let's just talk about the Jubilee then, because it's a really important tradition within the Hebrew Bible and Christian scriptures, which has an application for justice and including climate justice. And what's intriguing, you see, is that this theme entangles social justice and climate justice. In Leviticus 25, it reads from verse 8, count off 7 Sabbath years. I have to move the image here so I can see. Count off 7 Sabbath years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7th Sabbath year amount to a period of 49 years. Then have the trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month. On that day of atonement, sound the trumpet throughout your land. Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. I'll stop there. Basically, what the Jubilee tradition institutes is that every 7 years, all the enslaved people would be set free. You wonder why they had enslaved people in the first place. That's a whole nother narrative. The second thing that would happen was that all the debts would be cancelled of all the people. And thirdly, that if you were poor and destitute, you were able to go on the land and glean off it. You know, I'd take food from the land for free. So it's the equivalent of the supermarkets being open for free today, and you're not having to worry about paying anything or going to the till. This was meant to happen every 7 years, and it was to reset the social order. And then every 7 years, got rounded off to 50 years, there was meant to be a major reset. And that major reset meant that the land that may have been taken off you because you were poor or destitute or got into some kind of trouble was given back. So every 2 generations, there was a reset of the whole social order. This is what was expected. However, and as you can see, it folds social justice, the whole notion of letting enslaved people go free, getting people out of financial difficulty, and environmental justice, letting the land go not be farmed and letting people glean off the land. It folds then social justice into environmental justice. The problem was that people couldn't do it. There are only 2 recorded instances of minor versions of the Jubilee tradition within Scripture. So consequently, because the Hebrews failed to do this, the Israelites failed to do this, by the time we get to the major prophets, the time of Isaiah says, look, you all failed to do this Jubilee stuff, and it's going to be the Messiah who's going to do this. It's not going to be anything that Israel can do. One must make until the Messiah. And he gives us in Isaiah 61, this fantastic passage about the Spirit of the Lord being upon the prophet, and the Spirit leading to the proclamation of the year of Jubilee, the good news, and Isaiah is projecting into the future. And lo and behold, if you know your New Testament scriptures, you'll know that when Jesus begins Jesus's ministry in the book of Luke, he appropriates this passage, goes to his hometown, opens the scroll and reads in the synagogue, and he reads this passage from Isaiah and says, this is the time of the Jubilee. It's happening now. You know, people are a little bit upset, have a right go at him. But what Jesus is doing is saying, my ministry, my life is going to be the embodiment of the Jubilee. It's happening now within those who choose to follow me and the ways of God, the Christian tradition as it becomes. So the Jubilee provides us with a really powerful trope for social justice. And as I mentioned before, in its origins, it folds social justice into environmental justice. The two are not separate here. Those connections are made. And if you know anything about the history of the Jubilee motif in contemporary Christian politics, you go back 20 years, there was a Jubilee 2000 movement where the Christian tradition in Britain, other parts of the world, joined forces to get debt cancellation for the poorest countries on the planet, using this motif to guide and affirm the importance of social justice. I just want to turn now to the second point, which is Black liberation theology. Look, there are many variations of the Christian tradition, too many to mention. And you take a whole course of months to look at the Christian tradition. The Christian tradition that I work with is called Black liberation theology. Black liberation theology emerges in the civil rights period. In the late 1960s, James Cone, the father of the discipline, attempted to merge the Christian theology of Martin Luther King with the racial politics, the critique of racism, in particular of Malcolm X. And we ended up with a theological system that became known as Black liberation theology. Very popular in the contemporary world because Barack Obama's pastor for 20 years was a Black liberation theologian. He sat under that ministry for 20 years before having a kind of a fissure, a rupture in that relationship in the first presidential election in 2008, but up until that point had sat under ministry that was committed to these values. The notion that God is a liberator, that liberation is a holistic process and practice, and that Christianity and social justice, including environmental justice, are inseparable. These things are interwoven. Therefore, one cannot be gung-ho for any kind of economic justice without thinking about the implications for environmental justice or racial justice, thinking about these themes are woven together in Black liberation theology. We teach courses on this, so to do it justice, you have to do more than 3 or 4 minutes. So what does this mean then, to talk about Jubilee for climate in light of Black liberation theology? What if we kind of work this through as a dialectic now, we get to the synthesis? How did these two forces merge in terms of thinking about climate justice? Well, there are 3 things that I think stand out. First of all, that we have to think of climate justice as being something hugely inclusive. Part of the problem is that in Britain, Northern Hemisphere, it's been predominantly white middle class movement. Hasn't been inclusive, hasn't been global. As a consequence, it has not fully reflected. It hasn't decolonized itself. It hasn't demonstrated its own true liberative potential, particularly even within the Christian circles in which I operate. I run a course earlier this year called Black, Green and Christian, which was to do this work, was to bring together Black and brown people with the climate justice agenda, because there had been this missing link. There hadn't been the inclusivity hadn't been underpinned within the movement. And secondly, and if you're talking about any kind of inclusivity, we have to think intersectionally. Kimberly Crenshaw has taught us to, the African-American legal scholar who coined this term to think about how race, class, gender intersect regarding any social issue to either empower or marginalize people. So while we're talking about being inclusive, we've also got to ask critical questions of ourselves. Who's being represented here within the Black community? How do I, as a heterosexual a Black male, come to this table, and how representative am I? So I have to be self-critical about how we even do this work within our own community. The second theme then that emerges is we have to think historically, because if we are, hold on, let me just check I've got the right one there. Whoops, for some reason, I've got two images that are the same there. Forgive me, I just realized for some reason, this has pulled up two screens, two similar images, which shouldn't be there. This should be something else, but don't worry, these things happen. What I wanted to talk about was the need to think then about climate justice as a historical process. And if we think about it as a historical process, then we cannot separate it from history. In the Caribbean, many of the climate change issues that communities face, my parents from the Caribbean, are related to colonial history. And so consequently, when we're talking about COP26, about how we fund the losses and the damages, well, actually, Caribbean people were saying, well, but this goes way back. It isn't just about the present. So we not only have to think about intersectionally, we have to think about historicizing these issues. They haven't just emerged in the last 20, 30 years. For many indigenous people in the Southern Hemisphere, this begins in 1492. You know, and when Columbus sails the ocean blue, we know the first major climate disruption takes place of what the Spanish are doing in the Americas in the 17th century. So these things are historicized. And for some reason, I got the same picture up twice. I'm not sure what happened there. Maybe this image just didn't want to leave my screen. So consequently, if we're talking about inclusivity, we're talking about historicizing, then we have to talk about reparations. And that, rather than justice just being an abstract concept, we have to think about repaying for damage done. So how does the Jubilee tradition funnel into this? Demands an inclusivity. It demands that we historicize. It demands that we frame justice in a different way. Biblical tradition has a strong notion of restitution when damage is done, and that's where the reparations movement comes from. Thank you. Oops. There we go. I'll stop sharing the screen. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very, very concise, but very clear, actually. You know, don't worry too much that you haven't had the many, many months to deliver that, because that was the coherence there was fantastic. So thank you very much. Anybody, I meant before, I'm sorry to ask if anybody had a direct question for Shannon. I'm sorry, I didn't do that. I slipped my mind. But has anybody got a direct question for Robert before we move on? No. So that leaves us with Kamran. Would you like to go next?
Hi, everyone. I suppose going last just kind of puts me under pressure now, and really, I'm just going to underwhelm everyone with everyone's had made some really brilliant contributions. I'm not going to focus on my faith as a Muslim. I think Shannon said it really well, and I agree with him in that sense. I want to focus, I'm a grassroots activist. I work for the Baha'i Trust, which is a network of 22 mosques around the country. I'm also the director for the Islamic Foundation for Ecology and Environmental Sciences. And I want to focus my contribution around the practical elements of faith and what they can do as a whole to give a platform. And so, you know, it's an estimated 85% of the world's population associates themselves with a faith. And we know that places of faith, whether it's a mosque, a church, a synagogue, a temple, they all have the power to influence all those who attend to worship. The majority of our holy books and scriptures contain vast amounts of teachings on nature and the environment. And we're now seeing prominent faith leaders, scholars, attempting to instill a spiritual imperative into the environmental discussion. We've seen the Pope's encyclical, which is very powerful, very straight to the point. There's the Islamic Declaration on global climate change, the Lambeth Declaration, and so much more. And with that 85% of the world's global population religiously affiliated, now harnessing faith groups can be one of our strongest tools in tackling the crisis that we're facing. And there's no doubt that faith connects with people's emotions and personal lives, And so it's an excellent method of mobilizing people. And in addition to values and teachings, faith institutes around the world hold enormous amounts of assets globally, and they have the power to drive enormous change. Now, you might be surprised to know that according to the United Nations Environment Programme, it is estimated that religious organizations control 50% of the world's schools. They have 10% of the financial institutions. They own 8% of the planet's habitable land surface. In addition to that, there's 37 million churches, almost 4 million mosques, thousands of synagogues, temples, places of worship. So we can see that faith establishments, they own huge amounts of buildings, and therefore, because of that, they're able to make decisions about how they use energy, water, and other resources. And owning half the schools in the world, they are in a prominent position to educate a mass audience and lead by example. And before I forget, let's not forget that faith institutes have an estimated $3 trillion invested around the world. So with this in mind, their purchasing power and influence becomes increasingly apparent. But you know, I'm not here to make the case that faiths are environmentally friendly religions. You know, I agree with everyone's scriptures. We all have great scriptures. However, I have to say that I am sometimes troubled with that 85% statistics. You know, I battle with the thought that if the majority of the world's population identifies with a faith that's environmentally friendly, that teaches us about care for creation and stewardship, then why have we managed to get ourselves in this situation now? You know, and I think it's fair to say that somewhere down the line, we have taken our eye off the ball. And as Arthur rightly said earlier, modernity has kind of taken over. But, you know, saying that, I'm also pleased, you know, to see now that the faith community is rising to the challenge. They're starting to be seen and heard. I myself, as a Muslim, am involved in the environmental and climate activism, mainly motivated by my faith. And I believe that standing up for climate justice is an act of worship. And Shannon mentioned the concept of Tawheed, which was about the oneness of God, that you cannot be close to the Creator if you're not close to his creation. And I saw, you know, it became very apparent for those of us who were at COP26 that the faith community has stepped up. You know, people of faith were there in their numbers, and it pleased me so much to see that faith actors were starting to get noticed and were seen as a credible voice. Now, organizations like Faith for the Climate and others were very effective in mobilizing for climate justice. So practically, how can faith establishments play a role in climate justice? You know, I say this quite often. We're very good at, you know, especially places of worship or faith. When something happens, we're very good at sending our thoughts and prayers. You know, firstly, I think we're at a time now where it's no longer enough for us to be sad about devastation being caused across the planet, you know, or to hold any of these crises that we're seeing, to hold them in our thoughts and prayers. It's no longer enough for us to feel sorrow, anger, and guilt. It's no longer enough for us to release statements alone. You know, we have to convert these feelings into something more meaningful, which brings about systemic change. So I believe faith establishments, just a few points for me before I end. What are the things that faith places can do? Number one, they can invigorate the teaching of scripture on care for creation in their teachings, talks, and sermons. I think we can see more of that. We should be seeing more of that. Faith places and establishments can actualize these teachings by promoting earth stewardship and sustainable living to their congregations and communities. It should be very much part of everyday life, not just an event every now and then. Faith establishments can establish the greening of places of worship, community centers, and spaces where they all gather so that they minimize the impact on natural resources. Number 4, I think this is one of the most important ones. Places of worship have a large platform, so they can use those platform, give that platform to activists. Now, places faith leaders may not themselves be fully clued up, but give that platform to activists so that they can use it to call for a just transition, for climate justice, and to stand up for the rights of the most vulnerable people affected by the impacts of climate change. Places of worship can use their influence to hold local authority and government agencies to account, especially on climate and biodiversity targets. Like it was mentioned earlier, when it came to the Jubilee debt campaign, the churches were very active. And most importantly, working with other groups and individuals, both faith and non-faith, who are committed to this cause, because together we're all stronger. And no doubt, together we are more powerful and influential in calling for climate justice, for a fair, equitable, and prosperous future for us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kamran. Sad to see Shannon had to leave, but we'll have to muddle on without him, won't we? What pity. Thank you so much, Kamran. I think you've at the end there, actually, you've raised things at the end that I think are absolutely core to probably what we're all thinking in a sense, in that, you know, how do we move from caring deeply, you know, trying to voice our conviction, feeling sad, all of those things, into something that's more radical, can genuinely be kind of mobilized in an activist way. So I think you've ended our little talk here wonderfully. So can I now open this discussion up for questions? I guess, first of all, it might be that the panelists want to ask one another questions. I'd be happy if that felt like the right way of going.
Sure. It would be great to know how, from all the traditions, how they have moved from the scripture to practice on this. If there are any concrete examples. I mean, I can give some in terms of the tradition that I work in. There are obviously numerous Christian climate action groups working across the country, doing work on the ground in terms of churches and entangling climate justice with social justice in terms of becoming green churches, carbon neutral churches, as well as encouraging members of their congregations to actively participate in advocacy and change. Some of my students will be participating in the Stop the Oil protest, so let me say sorry in advance if they do shut down the country in a few weeks' time. But it would be intriguing to know what lengths people are going, apart from the personal, political, to the advocacy dimension and the outright resistance movements as well.
Sorry, can I just briefly answer that, Robert? In Birmingham, in our mosque, we are, we're doing lots of change around individual consumption and change, and we're making some of those change in the mosque. They're not always necessarily, we don't win the argument by turning it into an environmental argument. Sometimes if you make an environmental case, people switch off. So we have to work out what touches most people's values. So our mosque, for instance, we have 22 mosques, 20 of them have solar panels now, but the way we convinced the trustees was not the environmental case, it was the cost-saving case, but it was a win-win for us. Same with going to a more vegetarian, plant-based diet. If you talk about climate change, people switch off, but if you talk about people's health, people are more likely to listen. So it's important to know who you're talking to and how the language. Also theology, I think we're at a different generation. 15, 20 years ago, the imam or the vicar, what they would say on the pulpit would have strength. Now it doesn't. I don't think they have that influence anymore. So people don't like to be preached at. When you say, thou shalt do this and the Quran says this, you know, verse so and so, so and so. It goes in one ear and comes out the other. It works better when you give narratives, when you give stories that people can relate to. And the third aspect is we found, like I live in Sparkbrook, which is one of the most socially deprived areas in the country. It's famous for Citizen Khan. But quite often when we talk about climate justice, we think about the global south, and we have huge issues of climate justice within the UK, whether it's access to food, or whether it's energy poverty, or whether it's pollution, air pollution, and it's the poorest, even in the UK, that suffer those, and we're seeing it now. And it's not easy for you to get people to change their consumption. They have no alternative. So then you have to go for systemic change, and you have to start pushing the council to do things differently, or the government. But again, from a Muslim perspective, so my last point is sometimes it's difficult for us to overtly get involved in systemic change because of post 9/11 and post 7/7. If we ever call for democratic change or systemic change, we get pulled under the issues of prevent and counterterrorism, and it has happened a number of times. But you know, we keep fighting that, and we'll keep, you know, we keep. So we are involved in now trying to bring about systemic change. So we're doing a bit of both.
Can I, before we talk further, can I just interrupt? And Rob, somebody's trying to get into the room. Hannah's trying to get in. I've just got a little text message. It's all right. Thank you, Kamran. Does anybody else want to answer Rob's original question or pick up on what Kamran has just offered there?
Maybe I could add a little. I mean, certainly, I can't say that all Baha'is are devoted to the climate. It's been an issue in the Baha'i community for a very long time. I think the Baha'i community has put out like 42 statements on climate and environmental sustainability issues in the UN context over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. In America, there's an online teaching institute under the National Baha'i Community that offers courses on climate change, on agriculture and a sustainable approach, on sustainable development, and so that many people can take courses that relate you might say, the science to the spirituality, and can learn how to live their faith more effectively by combining the two. So there many people go through those courses, and we have a Baha'i-inspired International Environment Forum, which is a professional organization of Baha'is who've chosen careers in this area, and some of them have had quite high positions. One of them coordinated all the negotiations leading up to the Paris Climate Agreement, for instance, in the Secretariat of the convention. He was a high official in the Secretariat. I mean, my own career, in the United Nations and in UNEP, and was building environmental programs among governments. And I know of many other Baha'is who, through their values, have chosen a career that would allow them to do something practical to take this forward. Also, all around the world, Baha'is focus on building stronger community, not only among the Baha'is, but with everybody around them in the neighborhoods they're in, trying to overcome the racial barriers, the gender barriers, and so on, and getting communities to read their own local reality. What are their problems? Often they're environmental, and what can they do to find solutions to them? Not something imposed from outside, but coming in. And lots of children's classes, so that children can learn these values in children's classes, and you get the pre-adolescents together to see the pleasure of being altruistic and cleaning up their neighborhood, or picking up trash, or planting some trees, or in some way doing something practical to improve their own neighborhood. It becomes more meaningful. And once they've learned the pleasure of being altruistic, they're much less attracted by the materialist, selfish kind of things that are marketed to them by the economy outside. So those are a few examples of what within the Baha'i community, with those we partner with across all the faith traditions, we work together. I've been involved. I was at the Windsor Summit on religion and conservation in 1995 for the United Nations to present the issues to religious leaders. And so we've been involved in the interfaith movement as well, building partnerships across all the faith traditions to work on these. So a few examples of what one can do to try to make things work. Of course, we have to still tackle the whole economic system, and that's the big challenge is what to do with giant corporations and the stock markets and the banking system and so on. There's such an inertia there that all that we can do on the good side is hasn't yet swung the balance away from those who are still driving things on the bad side. And that's where our big challenge ahead is, how to somehow come to grips with that. And maybe it'll collapse of its own accord. And then we say, we can be building already what will take its place. So that it may be a shock, but if we're already saying, what is a better society that our faith traditions can put forward? We've had beautiful examples here in the Muslim traditions, Christian traditions. That's where we need to be focusing on. Tearing down will only go so far. We can be building the alternatives already. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to say something next? Sai, you're muted.
Yeah, I've got a question really for all of the people who spoke. And it's picking up on a part of what you said, Robert, on God as a liberator and Black liberation theology. I'm extremely rusty on this, but many years ago, I was looking at the Catholic liberation theology in Latin and Central America, and the way in which it was a fundamentally a very powerful force for quite a significant amount of change. And I could not be looking. I'm not seeing that same power at the moment within theology, and I'm wondering how all the panelists regard what that liberation theology might look like in this period, and how to develop it. How do we develop it, and how do we, if with different faith, relate to that? So that's a sort of like a series of questions, but just around that issue. If you could give me some insight.
Yeah, I think I can chip in. I think there are three things. First, I would say, in terms of Caribbean history, outside of American history, North American history, the best example of liberation theology and its intersections with environmentalism has been Rastafari. You know, Rastafari was vegan before people knew what veganism was, and caring for the land and going back to African traditions of respecting the land as part of creation, but deeply embedded within first generation, second generation, third generation, and Rastafari teaching. So there's an example. We have a liberation theology, which is holistic and embedded in sustainability. So I think that's, to answer the first question. The second part, I think you're completely right. Contemporary theology lacks imagination on this. It really does. And so one of the ways in which I've been trying to re-engage these discourses in my own work is through the arts. I have a research project at the moment with an artist where we are trying to redesign icons to reflect climate justice and climate and sustainability. So we have a project called Our Lady of Climate Justice, which we're working on. So we're trying to spark the imagination in a really kind of provocative way at this particular point in time. So that's one way in which we're trying to do it. The other way is, again, drawing on the Jubilee tradition, is working with marginalized people and engaging them with the issues, with the discourse. So I have another research project, which is at Winchester Prison, where we're training offenders in rewilding as a skill to address recidivism, because the more highly trained offenders are, the less likely they are to reoffend. But it's ultimately that the ulterior motive is to engage them with issues around sustainability, environmental justice, carbon economy, politics. So that's one way in which you can do it, working from the bottom up, as well as trying to ignite the theological imagination. So those are two examples that we're working at the University of Winchester.
Brilliant. Who else would like to say something? Thank you, Robert. Madge, thank you.
Thank you, everybody who's spoken. I'm feeling really heartened and strengthened by what everybody said. And I'd just like to pick up on the theme of liberate, God as a liberator. And for me, everything inner has to be reflect everything outer and vice versa. And I'm a frontline activist, which means I glue myself to things and climb on things and get pulled around by security guards and police quite a bit. So some of the stuff I do makes me confront myself a lot. And I have to really do a lot of work, you know, I mean, I was out yesterday in front of a chemical factory that makes paraquat, and I had a real meltdown in the afternoon because I realized how stressed I'd been when I hadn't thought I'd been. And so for me, I've got to seek God in myself in order to be liberated, in order to be able to not only do the stuff that I do without, you know, completely being self-destructive, but in a way that brings me closer to God and that inspires my next. Am I making any coherent sense to anybody?
So far, yes.
Right. So for me, I have to do that inner work of seeking my liberation so that I can act with freedom. Because if I act with freedom, then I can act in a way that God wants me to act. Because what stops me from acting in a way God wants me to act are the same things that are killing the climate, because it's not plastic or oil or pollution that's killing the climate and killing other people. It's the greed and indifference and apathy of the human heart, you know, and if we can't overcome those things in ourselves, then how can we move forward? And I'm sorry, I'm probably sounding incoherent and preachy. I'm feeling very tired at the moment. So I'm not my best, but thank you for what you do and for what you say.
Thank you. Did anybody else that have their hand up? Rob. Thank you. You're muted. Good.
Yeah, I guess mine's, I don't know, I sort of wanted to be a provocation to all of the panelists and to hear responses. And I think all of you've touched on bits of it, but I wanted to kind of press a little bit harder on just a few things, because I do, as sort of Kamran showed with, you know, those statistics of like how much, you know, how faith is in our lives and religions, and I often say this, of like all cultures are or were religious. You know, if you look back at human history and how we use language, it's always been that way. And I'm just really interested in how, and another thing you said, Kamran, about you know, I won't say it, I'll say it a different way, but you know, if we'd listened all along, you know, to the injustices as they piled up and they piled up and they piled up. Yeah, there were some events like 1492. It's hard to have kind of responded to that, but to respond to that, I guess. But you know, if we had listened to all of these inequalities growing and listened to people crying out, you know, we wouldn't be here. And that's a really interesting, I think, thing there. And so my question will kind of revolve around, you know, what the role and like how to kind of supercharge some of the faith stuff. I gave a talk up at COP, gave a speech up at COP saying, you know, I had a real problem with how we often pass the mic. We often pass the mic to someone, a person of color or an indigenous person or someone on the front lines. And then we sort of like tick our box and then we go home and say, oh, we passed the mic, and we post it on Twitter. But we don't listen to what's really being said. And what's really being said is the whole system is in, you know, especially often, you know, you talked about this in terms of reparations, but the whole system in the North where you are is destroying our way of life. And not only that, you know, we're seeing that right now in for those of us really suffering from the cost of living crisis or from inflation. And I had a wonderful conversation this morning about, you know, the different rising tides that are coming to engulf us, and people's responses to those rising tides are often to kind of either individualize or create small levies around a little group that they're working with, whether that's mutual aid. And the worry about that is that we're not getting right to the turning the taps off, you know, what's bringing the water in, because as far as I'm concerned, by the time God floods us all again, it's too late and humans have failed. I don't want to get to the ark. So how do we create that supercharge to get down there? Because these religious networks and these activist networks, we're at a place now where there's a sort of mycelium of interconnection, and we can put some energy through to that and bring us together. And I'm really inspired also, Arthur, by the Baha'i faith and how it sort of tries to kind of come up that unity. But I suppose what I also want to say is about, you know, wanting to radicalize beyond passing the mic and saying, well, actually, you know, if people did listen to the scripture and act on it, you know, that leap of faith and say, well, what if I did walk what the scripture said? And if you're a secular person, what if I did act on my moral conscience all the time? Where would that take me? And yes, it's okay to be wrong. I think every scripture says it's okay to be wrong. So how does that happen? And I think that to kind of round it up, you know, and you know, what we're doing here in Jubilee sort of is like, it's, you know, part of this provocation is saying, you know, there's a kernel here somewhere, because you know, in the system has got so rancid that, you know, reparations that you were talking about as well, Robert, you know, and this is again a provocation here, it's like reparations without debt cancellation is effectively money laundering. It would be taking funds through a global South country, and that those South countries, you know, now that 54%, you know, 54 countries are now in debt distress, they would then have to use that money to pay back private creditors or to relieve it. So, and that's terrible. So it feels like debt cancellation is, you know, a massively part. You talked about the slaves as well, and so much of that was debt bondage. We don't call it that nowadays. We've done away with debtors' prison. We do it we do it in another way, in this pernicious way of a sort of living prison, which sort of the welfare state has kind of provided to an extent. And I just wanted to kind of really understand how faiths can really reach into this. And you said that, Kamran, about not wanting to be preachy, but it's really important that this moral authority, whether it's through faiths or through secular moral authority, can be turned into real authority. And I think that does come from frontline work and internationalist work, but frontline work now as well, because that moral authority often actually lives with the poor, which is something that all of the prophets from these faiths have understood. And so, yeah, I just want to know what the steps forwards are.
Thank you, Rob. Arthur, would you like to?
I was very inspired by what Robert was saying about the Caribbean. And while I must admit that I do have some distant ancestors who were slave owners on Barbados several centuries ago, most of my work was spent in the Pacific Islands. And there's been some very interesting creative recent work with the Pacific Conference of Churches in Fiji, and the leader of the theological college there, who were actually jointly organizing, because I chair the Religion and Environment Working Group of the G20 Interfaith Forum. And we're having a webinar in a couple of weeks on ecological racism and deep sea mining, because the mining companies want to come in and destroy the ocean bottom to make batteries for the rich, and totally against the traditional sense of unity with the ocean's Pacific Island peoples. Of course, I lived for many years in the Pacific Islands, in a particularly colonial country called New Caledonia, feeling where we were very much involved with the people in the independence movement. And while we didn't get involved politically, they were our good friends who would come for dinner. And then, so my wife actually headed the audiovisual section of the Kanak Cultural Office, and making films. I published papers on traditional knowledge and its value, trying to restore what was destroyed by the colonial system. So I resonate very much with what you said. But I was just thinking, that region has been trying to break with the economic system in quite a unique way, in that they did a report last year on reweaving the ecological mat. It's like, how do we get away from GDP as the measure of everything good? And Vanuatu in particular started even a decade ago with this kind of creative thinking to go back to the villages and say, what do the people really want? How do they measure their well-being? How do they imagine getting progress in their own context, keeping their social relationships and maintaining the links with traditional values and so on? And they published, the National Statistical Office published this last year a new you might say, well-being in Vanuatu. They throw out GDP and say, we've gone back to the people to what they really want, and we're now redesigning the measures of our progress that relate to what the people really say they want. And we want to get away from this economic system that is always exploiting and making money and so on. So there's some creative things happening in a constructive way, with the faiths very much involved, along with the other people. And I think this may be worth looking at. You even say in the Caribbean. I did quite a work in Belize, but many years ago. And so I think that some of the smaller countries can be more creative in cutting loose from the economy to some extent and the pressures that are going on outside. And that, I think that should encourage us to see where else we can also begin to make a difference and build something new and better to replace this rotten system that's destroying us. Thank you.
Every time I forget my mute. Thank you, Arthur.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind responding to Rob's question. I think there are two things that I found really helpful in terms of working through the processes of change. And one is, the traditional Christian fudge, which is the now and not yet, that we serve a God who works both inside and outside of history, which means some things we will be able to change, some things we'll never be able to change. So I recognize that there are always limitations to what can actually be done around any theme, whether it's climate justice, whether it's racial justice, there are always going to be limitations. The second thing, which is related to that, second concept of practice, is what African Americans call fugitivity, call it maroonage in the Caribbean, which is the whole idea of living as a fugitive within any social order. And that means recognizing that the system is always going to be against us. And therefore, we're always trying to undermine and resist at every level. And that kind of mindset leads to particular forms of fugitive practice, forms of resistance, covert or overt practices. And that's been very much part of African diasporan history, in terms of living in highly racialized societies anyway, living with a kind of fugitivity. So I found that to be quite helpful in terms of framing the kind of approaches that I can take and accepting that there are limitations. That doesn't mean you kind of pass the buck. It just means that you're always looking at ways in which you can undermine and destroy what there is. So, for example, in Winchester, they have a panel that works with the local authority to raise the money for retrofitting, and it's billions of pounds. And one of the ways in which I've attempted to resist some of the ideas that are taking place is by introducing people from the global south as part of this forum with Winchester. We've now got the group has swelled to become much more international. And that means that we have to therefore be in dialogue with communities who are going to be detrimentally impacted by decisions that we make. So it's kind of undermined the traditional way in which county council planning takes place by introducing these voices that are non-residents, but it's to undermine and subvert. And that's one of the ways in which we can then develop, new forms of change and practice. So that kind of helps. If my whole, agency is geared towards subverting. I should say that fugitivity in theory, in literary theory, and in its practice in America argues that you cannot change the system unless you blow it up. So you have to destroy it. So it's a recognition of what you're just saying. Fred Morton is the guy who writes about fugitivity. You have to blow it up. That's the end game. And if we can't blow it up, we're going to be subversives, undermining it and messing with the system at every point.
Thanks, Robert. I don't think I'm allowed to use the word blow it up, but the freeze unfreeze model, or the freeze free, I have a more of a personal answer, my own individual kind of journey on this, because I've been through a period where I've had my beef with faith establishments, because I find them very annoying when it comes to bringing about change, doing things. They quite often use faith establishments as a way to control power. It's a power platform. I'm not gonna lie. I've been through phases in my life where I struggled with my faith because of some of those things. And believe it or not, in my previous life in the international development sector, I was talking to some villagers from the indigenous community who weren't religious, they weren't scholars, but they were able to reignite my faith by talking about spirituality in the trees, and it really helped making that connection. But I'm also now finding that there's a big difference in people of faith and faith establishments, and there's not always a connection. So during COP26, I was having lots of faith-inspired climate activists who were all out there, putting, on the picket line with their placards, and almost all of them were asking, well, how do we get our church involved? How do we get our mosque involved? I don't quite have the answer for that. I think every place is individual, every place is different. You can't have the same language that speaks to everyone. Me, on a personal level, I've just come to Shannon was speaking about the concept of Tawheed, about your relationship with God. I'm going to die one day, and I'm going to be in the court of a higher power, and I'm going to be answerable for myself. As long as I, on a personal level, can say I carried on fighting, I carried on standing up for the cause, that's enough for me. How much big systemic change I'm going to be able to bring about, I think I'll go mad. And I'm trying to disconnect myself too much with that fight. Otherwise, you end up trying to talk to everyone and you end up speaking to no one, just because you get so frustrated. So I kind of get where Rob was asking that question. And even in my contribution, I toned down a lot of things that I really wanted to say about places of faith and how they can be doing a lot more. I'll give you another example. Our local bishop, a lovely person, but I mentioned Laudato Si to him, and he said, Laudato what? So, it's always the environmental people who are hearing it. We're not getting it out to, but I'm still trying to figure that out yet, how we get them more involved. And I think it will start slowly. We may not have to blow it up, but we do, I think we need to start making changes one step at a time, bringing newer people in. That's what we've been doing in our mosque here.
Thank you, Kamran. I've got some hands up here. I think, Madge, yours is a legacy hand. I think it might have been up from before.
No, sorry.
That's all right. I'm just
shut me off if you like, Darcy.
Because Nick's had his hand up for a while, and then Lizzie. So can I bring Nick and then Lizzie in, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you all for wonderful, wonderful presentations. Really, really appreciate them. A couple of points. Wanted to pick up on Robert's point about fugitivity, and also relate it to Malcolm X's Nation of Islam, and also the work of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, a few years ago. And it seems that the only way to, as you put it, blow up the system is to practice what perhaps Sheldon Wallen calls fugitive democracy, which is go back to the roots, go right down to the communities and work within the communities in order to upset the setup, as it were, very much. So in that way, I think one of the focuses should be on the democratic systems that we have, because what we have really is not democracy. I mean, let's face it, this representative stuff is just, it's a sham, in many ways. So we need to go back, to communities. And the Muslim Brotherhood were very successful, across Egypt and I think Tunisia and so on, by working with communities. Similarly, Nation of Islam, breakfast clubs and so on in America, and they were able to, and in fact, that's what made them such a threat to the system, as it were, in many ways. So yeah, I guess my point is, how can we get religions back to the roots, you know, back where they really, really started? Because religious movements, they are movements, religions are movements effectively, and, you know, they need to start from the roots. Arthur, I had a question for you. Oh, sorry, one more thing for Robert. Yeah, Robert, you talked about 1492, and I think Rob also echoed it. And this whole notion of racial capitalocene, this is when, you know, capital really started to exert its forces on the earth. And it seems to me that our whole understanding of climate change, or the way it's portrayed, you know, we're living anthropogenic climate change, we're in the Anthropocene, and that whole framing of it says that we're all responsible, all humans are responsible, but it's just a tiny socioeconomic group of people from, you know, a tiny part of the world that really have had this impact. And again, it comes to this issue of reparations, that we need to raise awareness about it very much, you know, that, look, what is happening now is the consequence of this tiny group of people, you know, socioeconomic group of people from a small part of the world. So we need to raise awareness about it. Arthur, I had a question for you at the very beginning when you introduced yourself, and I'm sorry for this. It's a question I always have whenever I meet religious scientists, shall we say, and that is, how do you deal with the tension between religion and science?
In the Baha'i Faith, there's no tension. One of the fundamental Baha'i teachings is the harmony of science and religion. And, you know, we said, you know, that science without religion falls into materialism. Religion without science falls into superstition. And they're complementary. Science tells us about what we have to live in the physical world, but it doesn't answer those questions about our purpose in life and our higher spiritual nature and so on. That is complementary. And so it's only when we put the two together that we can get, you know, might say, a positive way forward that looks at both the material and spiritual dimensions of our development, both individually and collectively. So, you know, I was raised in a Baha'i family, but I always loved science, and I chose science as my occupation because it was in harmony with my religious traditions. In fact, one of the people who taught me about biology as a kid at Baha'i children's classes wrote a book that was the foundation of the Greenpeace movement, in fact, putting together, it was called Warriors of the Rainbow, about the beliefs of the indigenous people of Americas and coming together in unity. So, you know, there's never been a conflict for me. They've always fit together. Admittedly, there are many scientists who deny the religious side of things. I think only 2% of biologists are supposed to believe in God, for instance, according to E.O. Wilson. So there are those who reject and to accept it. But I say, we created a Baha'i-inspired professional organization of scientists, and we are openly Baha'i-inspired, and we have lots of Baha'i materials on our website, and we work with the National Science Council. We're accredited as a science technology organization in the United Nations. We take part in the scientific meetings. We bring in an ethical dimension. And so, but you know, say within that framework, there's been no conflict and you know, no difficulty at all. It's all been part of a coherent whole.
Thank you. Very quickly, Darcy. Sorry. I'm so sorry. I wanted to pose a question to all three. I know it's a big question, but how do you define justice?
It's a good question. I'll let you have it. And
Thank you.
Then we'll go to Lizzie. How do you define justice, folks?
I think if you simply look at the traditional symbol, which is the balance, at which, you know, both sides need to be equal. And I think in this case that every single human being, you know, needs to be part of that, you know, leaving no one behind. I think that, you know, these are all ways of defining justice, and certainly in this context here, eliminating poverty and excessive wealth, would be part of justice. Including both genders, including all races. Eliminating racism is all part of justice. The injustice is when somebody is excluded, left behind, marginalized, and so on and so forth. So I think it has its very practical expressions. There may be lawyers who would define it in some other way, but certainly my initial reaction would be that.
Thank you. Does anybody want to answer that specific thing, or do we move on to the other hands that are up? Does anybody else want to say something directly about justice?
I think Nick wanted to hear
lots of answers.
From the others. Is that right, Nick?
No. If possible, it's massive. It's absolutely massive. So it's not something that we could. But I just wanted a succinct.
I think Arthur said it really well. It's about that balance and equity, and what you take with one hand, you give back with the other, so everyone can enjoy the bounties and the bounties of this earth. I think, like, within all our faith traditions, simplicity, humility, modesty is one of the key values. And I think to bring about justice, we also need to go back to those values. I mean, if we mastered those, I think we'd find the solution to climate justice and the climate crisis. But it's easier said than done.
Okay, so I'm aware that we are now like 20 minutes away from our absolute final definite curfew. That's correct, isn't it, Rob? We absolutely can't go on longer than 20 minutes. And ideally, I expect you need it a little bit earlier than that, because there's another meeting following this that Rob's involved in on this same Zoom link. So so can I go to Lizzie, who's had her hand up a long time, and then I think it's Madge, and then Si, and then Daisy.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I'd just like to say that I missed most of the talks at the beginning, the presentations, I'm afraid. So apologies if this question has already been asked and answered. But being brought up a Mormon in the Mormon family, and believing that Jesus was a socialist, basically, and that we were all socialists, we were all put on earth to bring happiness and a good future for everybody, not just ourselves, including, everybody. And then seeing Jomo Kenyatta talk on the arrival of Christianity in Kenya. He said, when the missionaries arrived, the Africans had the land and the missionaries had the Bible. They taught us how to pray with our eyes closed. And when we opened them, they had the land and we had the Bible. So it got to me that, religion has brought about all of this in a way. And so I'm not standing here accusatory of faith, but, how do you justify faith being the answer when it's perhaps the cause? And how do you, like Rob said, about how do you make reparations when you're using money garnered to make those reparations garnered from those countries in the first place?
Yeah, I don't mind answering that. I think it's a really good question, and it's a question which has been posed to Christian traditions. So, for example, I'm off to Barbados at the end of this month to make a program about the plantation in Barbados that the Church of England ran for 140 years. It's written out of the history books, because naturally, you want to present yourself as the abolitionists, not as the people who are in bed with the corrupt, brutalization of black and brown bodies that was, racial capitalism, plantation slavery. So you don't want to talk about that. And the reason why we're making that is to hold them to account, not only for their collusion with racial capitalism, but also for the environmental damage that took place as a consequence of that. So in many respects, this issue is now being unraveled and addressed by religious institutions. So for example, the Jesuits in North America have set up a fund of $100 million to repay African Americans for enslaved Africans who were used to build churches for the Jesuits and chapels as well. So there's an attempt to do this. The Episcopalian Church in North America is doing something similar. So there is an attempt by some religious institutions to address this. In Britain, we're a bit slow off the mark. The first church to do this will be later this year, will be the Baptist Church. And they're still negotiating how it's going to happen, but it's going to happen within that church. So it is being addressed, it is being raised, and institutions are being held to account, and some have responded.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to Madge and then Daisy and then Sai. But in the meantime, if there's anybody who hasn't said anything, if you want to just drop me a line, if you would like to say something, I'll make sure there's time for you to contribute. So Madge, back to you.
Oh yeah, I'll be quick. So many things have come up since I first thought I'd stick my hand up. I love what you said about fugitive behaviour, Robert, and I'm thinking there's so many people in British society who are white British who feel so dislocated and so marginalised that you know, the same prejudices are applying to these people. Just that point. The other one about blowing things up, the climate scientists think we might have about 3 years to turn the ship around. So I think, you know, faith organizations taking years to make their minds up, we're way past that. We need to be taking really decisive radical action now and really standing up, because if we don't and we let this happen, then we've really cooked it. So yeah, a bit of blowing up in a nice way, if you can blow anything up in a nice way. And the other thing is, so much of the behavior that is exhibited that destroys the climate might be described as the working out of childhood trauma. In the modern, particularly modern Western society, we don't nurture children. I've worked in societies where children spend so much time being nurtured and included, and they don't have the need to go after all the consumer goods that children in our society defines ourselves by the consumer goods we can buy, not by the relationships that we have. And if we can't start nurturing children and bringing them up as a society and living in multi-generational households again, and including elderly people in the care of the young, we're really stuffed, because people will be filling that gap left where relationship would be with stuff bought in cheap shops, which are destroying us all. So I'll dry up because I'm aware that other people want to go. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. Daisy. Thank you for your patience, Daisy.
No, that's okay. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? So my question was kind of building off what Rob said, although obviously Rob put that in the scale of that question brilliantly. So I'm sort of not going to attempt to mirror that, but I think he was kind of speaking about how you harness the sort of huge scale of influence that faith institutions have, but also this kind of like innate, what I would call activist tendencies in faith that is kind of like kind of being driven by values and morals to shape a better world. And so my question is just very small and practical in terms of in all of your kind of experience working in your communities, how our project, our movement, Jubilee for Climate, might speak to, might like actually work with and engage with faith-based communities to kind of to mobilize, to organize towards a better future.
Great question.
I mean, I don't mind throwing a few things. I think the three things that have come out of some research that we're doing at the moment in terms of engaging diverse communities. The first is locality. connecting the local and the global, because one of the ways in which we've often neglected hearing what local people feel the big issues are related to issues around climate justice, around global justice as well. The two are always intertwined. We've been saying this for 50 years to Christian Aid and they still don't get it, but the locality, the local is global because you've got diaspora communities, so people are involved in that sense. I think the second thing is representation. If you don't see people like you involved in this, you don't really have a stake in it. That's very much true in terms of British society. So one of the ways in which we're trying to do that within the university work, within some of the work that with the agencies that we're working with, is diversifying climate justice. So the people that are involved look much more like the communities that are that you want to engage with, diversifying. So that's the second thing. I think the third thing is really holding the leadership to account, because that's something we haven't necessarily done very well, is saying, look, Archbishop of Canterbury, to other people, divest. The Church of England has done a lot of this, but already in terms of divesting from fossil fuels, but holding them to account in order to make strategic changes, because they have the power and they can actually make changes very, very quickly. I'll give you an example of this. For years, when there were issues of injustice within the Church of England, people had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, so they couldn't talk about it. There'd be no change. So it was brushed under the carpet. And we knew that they could make change very quickly, but there was a claim they couldn't. So we made a panorama about this earlier it was last year. We made a panorama addressing this issue. They changed the policy overnight. The next day they said, we're getting rid of it. So, these things can happen, we just got to hold them to account. As you can imagine, I won't be on their Christmas card list or receiving an award from the Archbishop of Canterbury anytime soon.
Well done, you. Sounds like quite a badge of honour, that. Yep. Does anybody else want to answer Daisy's question?
Yeah, also from a practical perspective, I think know your audience. Different audiences have, they different values, the way you speak to them, how you don't just turn up and deliver a presentation and then go. It might be worth talking to whoever the influential, what they said, like the church is probably the only major structure, like with the Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, maybe even the Jewish. I think they all have individual sets of trustees for each. So get to know them, and rather than say, we want to talk to you about this, but ask them, what's your stance on climate debt? What's your stand? That way, even if they don't know, it gets them thinking, it sparks things up. So because when they're thinking for themselves, you've empowered them to provide solutions. But the last thing you want to do is just turn up, give a presentation and tell them to write letters to the MPs, and just give them a whole list of things that you want them to do, because people bring about change in different ways. I know in our mosque, we've actually brought about more change by asking the imam to pray slightly different. So when he does a communal prayer at the end, normally he would always say, oh God, please stop the oppression taking place around the world. Now in his communal prayer, he mentions climate change. And that in itself is a form of campaigning and advocacy, because people come and talk to him about it afterwards, and it gets more people talking. During just before COP26, he prayed for leaders to make bold decisions. And again, it's not something you may hear that in a church, but you definitely would never hear that in a mosque. So it's new things. It's the small things, slowly getting them on board. And then you'll find once you've empowered them, they suddenly feel like, yes, I will need to do my bit. And then when they're talking to the congregation, the passion comes out and you get more people on board. But every congregation, every community, even within faith communities, you have 100 different communities, whether it's geographically, culturally, language. There's never one language fits all.
Thank you, Kamran. Does anybody else want to respond to Daisy's point? Should we move over to Sai, who had a question, I think, or a point he wanted to raise?
We've got enough time. Not sure how much.
Depends. Does anybody else want to try to answer Daisy's point.
So there's a couple of, I mean, I feel this this hour and a half or whatever we've been here has been really incredibly valuable, and I've learned things which are I think quite profoundly more than thought-provoking. That's such a useless word. Something which I think can carry forward. I'm secular, or I don't have faith. I don't have a faith. I mean, I don't know if you don't have faith, but I can't ascribe it to anything. I think it was you, Robert, who mentioned about harnessing people to mobilize. So I think as someone who is secular, the question is, why do we find it so difficult to talk with people with faith? It kind of becomes an area which we don't engage in, and you've already pointed out that we've got 85% of the population are religious, and we engage in all sorts of ways, but we kind of then hold back. And I think also that isn't just confined to secular people, but it's also to people of religion, the interactions between religion and drawing those threads of common humanity and bonds together. How do we really progress and harness and use this power that has been so clearly demonstrated tonight in ways which, I mean, I'm going to take it back to that liberation, because I think we have to be really, really, really radical now. So that is part one of the question. Part two, I think, is a real point that you also brought up about subversion. I think that offers us such huge amounts of power in areas where we often feel very weak. Like we write to our MPs, but we don't expect anything to happen. We sign petitions, we don't expect anything to happen. We lobby and we don't expect anything to happen. If we started being subversive, and that example that you gave is so empowering, that actually we're dealing with the pillars of community, and at the same time, so I wonder for us as Jubilee whether there's something that we might really find within that idea of subversion or not. So yeah, those are my two quick points. One's more of a question, others reflection.
Does anybody want to respond? That is going to have to have been our last question, because we are now too near the end, but I would like to hear any responses. That'd be great.
I think whenever we work for unity across all of our different faiths or lacks of faith, we can always find some points on which we can agree. And I think that is what brings strength, you know. And I think the more we can find those elements that unite us, and that we will gradually be able to build momentum. And that's probably the most subversive thing of all. If we're no longer supporting the old system, and the more people stop supporting it and detach themselves from it and start living a totally different way and stop consuming and, you know, live a simple life and all the other things that our faith traditions do, that many secular people do as well. I think that will be perhaps the best way to go forward at the moment. And then I often, you know, well, I wouldn't say blowing things up. I think there's an enormous debt bubble out there between all the borrowing that governments have done, corporations have done, that consumers have done. And if somebody bursts that bubble, the whole thing will come crashing down. And that's some of my best hope for climate change, because if that happened, nobody could trade in fossil fuels anymore, because they wouldn't have euros or pounds or dollars to do it. And so I sort of keep hoping that someday we'll burst that bubble, and then we can start building something better to take its place. Thank you.
Can I respond directly to that, though? And there's a conversation I had as well, which is, it's similar to the fact that we were recompensing the slave owners until 2015. It's similar to the fact that if the slave owners are the debt bondage owners, are the people who own the debt, the creditors, we recompensed the slave owners back in 2008. the same banks, it's the same power in a different guise. And although I completely agree that that the bubble will burst at some point, the same people are warning about it, we have to make sure that the slaves get liberation and not the slave owners' compensation.
Absolutely. Okay, maybe it's time now for any final thoughts, and maybe final thoughts rolled into little checkouts, because we're very near the end.
I just want to finish with a quick quote from one of my teachers, Dr. Fazlul Khalid, who's the founding director for the Islamic Foundation for Ecology and Environmental Sciences. And somebody asked him very similar question around the role of faith, and faith has caused all these issues around the world, or why is God causing climate change, etc. And he just replied, I think he replied by saying, look, let's all unite, let's save the planet first, and then we can argue about God later. And I think, us all coming together, that unity is not easy. Even in our disagreements, we can unite, like we agree to disagree. As long as we can do that, we come together, and that will slowly, and quite often it just takes for us to see other people doing things, and then people join slowly. Extinction Rebellion a few years ago were like, oh, we don't want to know, we don't want to be associated with them. But now people are, because of the state of politics, people are starting to understand why they were doing what they're doing. So it's a little bit more acceptable than it was previously. So I think we will start seeing the people's movement start growing now a little bit. People will be standing up.
Who else would like to say something to finalize or check out? Be quite nice to hear everybody check out in some way or other.
I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone. This has been such a incredible, enriching, inspiring session. And really, thank you for all of the panelists, for all of your time, for your expertise, and for all of the hard work you're doing in your various fields. It's incredible, and it's been really, I've got so much from this, and thank you for everyone for really great questions.
Thank you, Daisy. Jenny.
Yes, thank you, Daisy. There's a Quaker phrase, and I'm a Quaker, which is "this friend speaks my mind." And Daisy has just spoken my mind. I found this so stimulating and nourishing, and I really appreciate people's contributions and the nourishment I've received from listening this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you.
I'll jump in and say, I'm also echo everything that's been said. I'm so grateful that you're here. And sometimes the gratitude makes it feel like there's sort of now a barrier that, it's a debt of gratitude. It's interesting. But I also want it to feel like an open door always. I really want to know and continue to hear about the work you're doing. And Jubilee is always an open space. It's your space as well. It's everyone. So if you ever want to pop into a meeting or get inundated with WhatsApp messages about stuff, or whatever it is, join Madge gluing herself. Please stay in touch.
I'll glue myself to any one of you guys any day. It would be a privilege. And don't feel for a moment that there's not enough of us here, because what we say and what we think and what we put out there to one person or 1,000 people still creates change in the universe.
Okay.
So if you only say these beautiful things into the ether, it's still blessed the world.
Mm.
And you being here all together and making what unites us bigger than what separates us has blessed me enormously, and the world is blessed by these kind of interactions, and we need more of them. And because the world is like a parched land at the moment, you know, the world has so suffered from materialism and hard-heartedness, and it's time for the hearts to melt and for the beautiful rain of compassion and justice to fall down upon everybody. And this is a start, and let's keep it rolling.
Thank you. We have no minutes left, so does anybody want to say 2 words? You know, I will say thank you. They're my 2 words.
Keep the faith.
And absolutely, really beautiful, and thank you so much. It's really, really inspiring. Thank you.
Really inspiring.
Thank you all for sharing. It's been a pleasure, and wish you well for the future. We've got a lot of big work to do.
We have got a lot of work. Let's do that work. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.